sense which suggests the existential crisis of the state is mistaken. They don't need to be worried that all the people in the population are culturally homogenous in order to get them to fight. So, in that I half agree with you and half don't agree with you. The aim, you see, all the time when we discuss international migration, we should measure it against domestic migration. Why does London not pay money to Glasgow for all the Scottish boys and girls who migrate down there? And you can go on in this way. We want a world in which the conditions of domestic migration are the same as global migration. That's what I want. People are free to come and go, and we don't kind of tot up all these sums and payments. I agree with you that if public education is subsidised, that ought to be somewhere registered in the accounts, and indeed it is acknowledged by the British government. The Department for International Development is now financing a selection of Philippine nursing schools. That is an acknowledgement of the debt, and perhaps that could be formalised. And this is really not the same as repaying Social Security to Mexicans. They've earned that. I mean, that's a different question. But you come back to the Apollo example, that people return home and then have an immense effect on the domestic economy, so that governments ought not to be so worried necessarily about recovering the education, because they're investing in the longer term if their people come home.
Well, we have come to more or less time for a drink, but I think I'm afraid I don't want to extend this too much. Nigel, you came for a lecture here to the ISS several years ago, and I heard it. And I think you startled.
You heard it?
I was there. I heard every word, and I remember you startled the audience there by saying that there should be absolutely no restriction whatsoever on the movement of labor between countries. At this time, I've heard you talk about circulatory migration of a few years at a time with the right to return. Do you still hold the view that what you'd mentioned then, that people should be free to enter and exit as they like, completely free, or would you like any system of regulation in terms of circulatory migrations, which then inevitably bring in the question of the supply and demand gaps and how much and so on, for how long, and with what sort of rules? And again, we come into the same framework of regulation of labor flows.
No, well,
how do you stand on that?
I just said the conditions of internal migration should be the same as the conditions of international migration.
Okay, so it's very clear.
Yeah,
it's very clear. It's very consistent.
Yes. Because I think the problems can be accommodated. There are all sorts of problems in circulation, i.e., transmission. We've just had a glorious pandemic, non-pandemic, which necessarily concerns people moving, and Mexicans going to Hong Kong and all the rest of it. So there are all sorts of problems in the free circulation of people, of which the transmission of disease is one, but the transmission of terror is another, etc., etc. So it's not an uncontrolled system or an unmonitored system, but the conditions, we don't, you have to check against domestic migration. Is this really a problem of migration in the international field? That's the test. The test is, do we need this within countries, this whole control mechanism, or is it spurious?
Well, that's very nice. I think in terms of, I don't feel entirely satisfied with the entire conflation of internal and international. And I think there was something to bring out. Maybe it'll come up in later lectures or later sessions. But I think the big difference there is, of course, the legal and the rights of a citizen. You have purchase on the local state, but you don't have purchase on the state in countries outside. I mean, if you look at the large labor flows that go into the Middle East or here into Europe as well, as an alien, you don't have the same rights. And I think this uniformity of rights and access to this is quite central. But if you, for instance, you might be in Maharashtra, be told to get out of there, but you can go to your Supreme Court, file a petition, or somebody can on your behalf, and it actually can be stopped. So it becomes, so you have rights in a different sort of way. But I think that's the kind of a thing which you're also mentioning and raising both sides. I think that you need some kind of a framework for uniform rights, which people can claim regardless of where they happen to be. Well, there's a strong plea for a universal and uniform rights. I would completely agree. The one migration I haven't heard of is the one which is the largest in certainly in a country like India with all its population. And that's, of course, I mean, who's a migrant, you said? From one city to another, a province to another? What about a village to another? What about a home to another home? And of course, the biggest single migration is of girls who marry because they can't marry in the village. And they have to marry somewhere and go and set up shop again somewhere else. And then you get the subordination of women, both in terms of labor, of different belonging to new places, not having the same rights and everything else. That is the single largest migration, incidentally, which shows up if you look at movement which is more than 3 villages away from your village. I think that also deserves to be looked at to see how that migration, both in the mind and lives and in experience and so on, tallies with other forms and what the remittance flows there are.
Family reunification.
Family reunification as well, and the terms and the local state and the family state and the patriarchal state which then regulates this. But I find some similarities there in terms of positions of women and positions of unregulated, unprotected workers there as well. It's worth actually having a look at this. But with that, I'd like to thank everybody, especially our speakers. I think they deserve a hand from all of us. So thank you, Mahmood, and thank you, Nigel. And there's a drink upstairs where we can continue with the unanswered questions. I'm sorry I couldn't take another question from you, but you have the chance upstairs to ask it.